So welcome to the Mooseheart Campaign Conversations as Medicine podcast. My name is David Stevenson. I'm the CEO of the Mooseheart Campaign. Today we have a very special guest, the Honourable Marc Miller, who is the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations, and after being elected to Parliament in 2015 and previously serving as the Minister of Indigenous Services. So Marc, it's a pleasure to have you with us on the podcast, and welcome.
Thanks, Dave. Really happy to be with you.
Yeah. So we have a lot of important topics that we want to touch on today. But before we get started, can you tell us about how you first got involved in politics and then a little bit of your journey to your current role as Minister of Indigenous Crown Relations?
Yeah, well, a bit of an oblique way of getting in there. I'm a Canadian. I'm interested in my country, and as you mentioned, served and prepared, like anyone else that serves in the armed forces, to, you sign on that unlimited liability line. And so, I care for my country pretty much like anyone else does from early on. That's a bit of a leap to go from there and serving in politics. People can do different things in different ways to contribute to their country. So it's been an interest for a long time. I did practice law outside the country for about 8 years. From about 2001 to about 2008, and sort of got back into politics by supporting one of my closest friends in his campaign to become the member of parliament for Papineau in downtown Montreal. Who that guy is now the prime minister. So when it sounds sometimes odd to say that I just helped someone who was really close to me, because I would have done it for anyone else. That person just happened to be the guy that's now prime minister. So it started off with a small group of people that were just willing to help, a guy who had a vision, a dream, and trying to get back into a party that perhaps was not as welcoming to him as we'd imagined. And it came with helping to rebuild a party, helping to win a riding that is perhaps not is the second least wealthy in the country. And I kind of got the thirst for it. I had a corporate law career and practice in downtown Montreal that was very rewarding for me personally, and really enjoyed doing it. I wasn't saving lives, probably making a few miserable, but I did. I care for my country, like a lot of other people that when they see it going in a certain direction, ask themselves what can they do. And this is an opportunity I felt I owed to myself, my family, and my country. And obviously in there's a bit of luck, but a lot of hard work. And so as that member of parliament became then the leader of the party in 2014, so it's been 2013. It's been close to 10 years. It's something that I went through a period of reflection with my family to say, how can I serve? Do I just go in the background and support, or do I do like others and stick my neck out? Quit a job that I cared a lot about it, and try and represent part of the country that I know and love, and a people that I know and love, and get out of a comfort zone. And I decided to do that. And so I haven't really looked back, but it started with the kind of path I've described to you, which is a bit unusual, but I haven't looked back ever since, and really enjoying the job I'm doing now.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. What a story. Yeah. That's, I didn't know all the background about that, so I'm really it's exciting to have you here and in this role, and I'm particularly interested, now that you've spent a lot of time and play a major you're a major voice in this country's journey of reconciliation. I just wonder, since you've started, and maybe even since before you've started, what have you seen evolving in the country around reconciliation and around truth and reconciliation? How is the country going? This is a big journey we're on. You've got a unique vantage point. I'd love to hear what you're seeing from where you are.
Wow, I think we could probably speak about that for hours, because you're probably as passionate as I am about this. It's been quite a curve, I think, even for Canadians, the 95% of the population that does not necessarily interact with Indigenous people, mostly non-Indigenous. I've been reflecting over this last little while that if in the very privileged position that I have to be able to help change the discourse of the country, that if people had, even a few minutes to do what I do, or at least see what I see, the country would the face of the country would perhaps change, or people had such a great appreciation of, the reality out there, the good, the bad, the ugly, but also just the pure learning experience that is my everyday privilege to see is just incredible and very hard to describe, as you can hear me trying to describe it a bit clumsily. I'm always learning. I came to this job with a lot to learn, like any other Canadian, and just was willing to work with and see a mandate through that, is something today that is, I think, radically different than it was even a few years ago. And it doesn't mean that everything's been great. It certainly hasn't. There's documented failures of this government. There's some real documented successes of the government. But I think it starts with the realization as an individual that we're in a position of privilege, but also of ignorance when it comes to the reality of Indigenous peoples in this country, particularly coming from my perspective, which maybe sound weird for someone to hear from the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations, but it does guide my everyday activity, and it does make me constantly reflect on every policy action that we put forward as to whether we're doing the right thing, and whether this is something that is informed with the people who have been often on the losing end of a lot of these policies. Just as a real concrete measure in terms of the discourse in this country, when you try to measure it, we do polling on this as a government, or even as a party, and we see what we saw often with Indigenous issues is there is an awareness and a keen interest among the general population about Indigenous issues, but that interest spikes, and it usually spikes along inflection points that deal in and around crisis. So people get really interested when there's a crisis in the country, whether we're talking about water, whether we're talking about some painful things in and around solidarity movements. One example is the solidarity movement for the Wet'suwet'en that shut down parts of the transportation network in the country. Those types of issues tend to seize the imagination of the general public, but then it goes down. And what we see more and more in our polling is that awareness and the general kind of interest for it is at a level where there is a constant need and thirst for people to feel that their government is engaged on the issue. So it is a priority issue, always hard to categorize in that way, alongside the economy, alongside the environment. And what's interesting is increasingly among the youth population, and that's where education plays a huge role. Their two top issues often are environment and Indigenous issues, which was absolutely not the case when I got into politics. When I ran in 2015, if I were to knock, and I'm in a different position now, so it's very hard to, as a scientific measure, to say that people come up to me on the streets now in the last election and talk to me about Indigenous issues. Obviously, I was the Minister of Crown of Indigenous Services during a COVID period, where my work and the work of my team was critical just to help keep people safe and alive. But notably in 2015, people knew that Justin Trudeau was campaigning on with a lot of promises made to Indigenous peoples, and they were curious about it. But there was a lot of ignorance. You might hear at the door, we're really interested in these issues. We don't quite understand why Indigenous peoples don't pay taxes. That type of ignorance that can be hurtful, but that was there. Now, I think the narrative has changed. Among the population that you talk to that doesn't interact with Indigenous peoples on a daily basis, you see often issues like awareness in and around the search for truth, for whether it's missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, whether it's all the matters in and around residential schools and unmarked graves, matters in and around some of the big land claim settlements that are going on, as well as some of the socioeconomic issues. Water obviously has been at the front of people's minds for a while, but education, infrastructure, those are issues that Canadians want to see a government acting on. Obviously, that is at a level that obviously the awareness needs to get better and better in the sophistication and articulation of the different needs in different countries and different groups that have their unique voices and interests and keen matters that they are putting forward. It still is not at a level where you would think that this is a highly informed population or people know the issues in and out, but there is a thirst for knowledge, and I think that's very positive. And you're seeing it more and more among the youth. And I just look at my kids coming home talking about Indigenous issues. I wasn't taught that at all, and in some cases, that knowledge was actively suppressed. So that's a big difference. But it is we're talking about a generational shift because there's about 30 years between the time I went to school and my kids are going to school. So anyway, I rambled on, but I think that's a really important question. I'm actually really glad you asked it.
Oh, great. Well, yeah, it is it's well, first of all, just that your vantage point is really unique in this. And so I think it's really important for all of us to sort of try and take as many perspectives as we can. One of the things that, and you touched on this a bit, but I just want to, it's a real, as the population now gets interested, people go, hey, there's this issue and we're understanding it's complex and we don't quite understand it. There's a learning and a development that's happening there. But I'm also wondering, what do you think your average Canadian can actually do or participate? How can they be part of reconciliation?
Yeah, and I think, as in all these matters that are important to who we are as a country, and more importantly, where we're going as a country, that veil of ignorance that is violent and poisonous, it isn't sort of a passive veil that clouds people's minds and judgments, is something that constantly needs to be addressed and lifted. I think too often that duty and obligation has been on the backs of Indigenous peoples that have to constantly educate and re-educate people like me about the relationship, who they are, what the challenges are, why those challenges are there. I think our biggest, the biggest enemy is ignorance, and it's something that when it comes to communicating narratives, governments are singularly poor at doing in terms of framing and shifting as a society. And that's why I was talking about education. And even there, the Government of Canada, given our unique constitutional makeup, is even more unable to change the narrative because the education system is controlled provincially and hopefully more often than not independent from government. And that is something that is slow. It takes time, and there needs to be that thirst for people to educate themselves. So in the arts, groups like yours, raising awareness from the government, as bad as we are at changing people's minds, it is something that is critical to make sure that some of the policy measures that we're putting into place are successful. It's, I can speak to a leader in a community about reconciliation all day long, but if our own people are not recognizing that this is something that is actually having a tangible difference and worth pursuing, then in some cases we've all failed. And so that is the big preoccupation of mine, one of the many things that keeps me up at night. But it's something I think that for individuals out there, I think it's important to realize that there is a lot of stigma out there. No one, when we talk about reconciliation and it gets torqued in certain directions, people ask themselves, well, am I going to get asked to go back to Europe and give up my house? And that's, there is no credible leader in this country that would, Indigenous or federal or provincial, that would even frame issues in those ways. The reality is reconciliation is about a really long journey that is not necessarily linear or unidirectional, but it is one where people, and the awareness that underpins people's action and demand for their governments to do something is imperfect, and it's something that starts from a place of understanding and respect. And when people hear a lot of these narratives, it can be a bit overwhelming if you're not used to speaking about Indigenous issues or hearing about them. And people do ask themselves, what can I do? No one's asking the world from people. They're asking for some understanding, some compassion, and some respect. And with that as a starting point, in my mind, the world's your oyster in terms of learning, and then perhaps taking some concrete actions to address some of the harms that are intergenerational and are ones where people are expecting their leaders like me to do something about. There's so much to be done and so much learning to go still.
But what's so exciting is people are, and I'm glad you're seeing that and getting that reflected back, that people are there's a lot of interest and there's a sense of urgency on some level.
And it's stupid of me not to have mentioned the work that you're doing, because you're a much more forceful. The Mooseheart campaign is it's family. It started with a family that I've had the privilege of meeting that really wanted to raise awareness about the role of men in reducing violence and being understanding violence towards Indigenous women, and assuming our roles as men, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And that's an awareness campaign. I know you could probably testify to how difficult it's been, but it's gotten some real success and traction. There is no governmental entity that could have done an equal job to what you're doing. And I think raising that awareness is key. I know it's got a much more spread in the West than it does in this neck of the woods, but it's really penetrating. And my awareness around this campaign was raised to me by Regional Chief Ghislain Picard way before I was a minister, and conscious of his own role in particularly in his advocacy, but as a man. And that's something that has to be maintained and fueled in a sense. So it was a bit silly of me not to have mentioned the work that your organization is doing, because it has been key in raising awareness.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, and the story of Paul and Raven Mooseheart, who of course founded the campaign, and all that is happening from it is it's been a dance both with government support, as community support, people coming forward, and then I will mention the campaign. Paul and Raven started this before Me Too movement and before the Truth and Reconciliation happened. It was just a grassroots thing, and now it's becoming more and more sort of across the board, like a lot of Canadians seeing it. And I want to refer back, because we had a wonderful time a while ago in Ottawa with you and 9 other parliamentarians. And if you don't mind my mentioning that we spent a day together doing the 10 men, which was wonderful. And I just want to ask about that experience for you. How was that for you? And if you have anything to share about our day of doing 10 men. And I'll just share for folks that 10 men is the day of where we ask 10 men to come together, fast for the day, and think about those in their, we ask them to think about those in their family and community who they would be fasting for. But anyway, please share anything that if you feel to.
I'm a guy who likes eating a lot, so it's probably more painful than it is for other people that are used to fasting. And fasting is asking people to make a sacrifice so that you can spend the time reflecting on sometimes, and for some, if you're spiritual, praying about your family, your loved ones, those who some people have approached you to pray for or reflect on. But it also that concept of suffering and making a sacrifice to focus on issues that are very important, and usually over and above your daily needs. It's something that's doable. It's not for everyone, but it is something that allows people to get together, typically in solidarity. If you're a group of men, in this case, some members of Parliament who come from different backgrounds, represent different parties, but all have at heart Indigenous issues and raising awareness, not only for your campaign, but the issues more importantly that underlie it. And that, I think, is interesting. It's unique. I'm not used to fasting, so it does take some effort, as it does anyone else. But for me, that moment in time for fasting is often deeply personal, and it's very hard to share publicly because there's lots that goes through your mind when you're depriving yourself of sustenance. But it isn't also important for your own brain and heart to focus on your issues and issues that Paul and Raven have been at the forefront of for a long time now. And they're not ones that are familiar to me, because I'm not Indigenous. But I think when you talk about the role of people and raising awareness, there is a particular opportunity when it comes to asking members of Parliament to stand up for people that need to have their voice heard, without replacing it, obviously, on the Canada-wide stage. And so that is what I sort of thought about when I was spending that day fasting and trying to get through my normal work day. and it is something that I really enjoyed doing with my fellow colleagues, and I hope we can do it again, really.
Yeah. Well, it was an honor, and we it's just, I have to let folks know that we're just making this stuff up as we go. We're just going, okay, this is something we used to do, and we're not we don't have a grand plan beyond the big vision of like, let's create a country safe for all women and children. So yeah. So let's pivot a bit for a second. I'd like to ask you something that I've thought about a couple of times, which is your decision to learn Mohawk, and I think it was 2017, if I remember correctly. You said some, said some words in the House of Commons in Mohawk, and just want to hear that journey. How did that come about for you?
I wish I could say that it was some grand plan to get to where I am today. It wasn't. There was a lot. I was pretty naive, frankly, at the time, when I thought to myself that I could learn an Indigenous language. And so I don't want anyone to think that, somehow this was some design that turned out to be, a great idea, because I came about it quite naively, like you do with a number of things that go in one direction or go in another. So I guess the genesis of it was that I was a member of Parliament, but I was doing roundtables with Minister Bennett at the time, with Indigenous elders, talking about the issues they prioritize. But in this case, language. And one of the elders was reflecting upon the fact that, in a generation with the dying, looking at the demographics of first language speakers and the age group that they're in, just nature taking its course. In 30 years, there would be numerous dozens of languages eliminated if we didn't do something rather quickly. And it sort of struck me, particularly coming from Quebec, where language wars, I guess, for lack of a better expression, have defined my adolescence between English and French, the two colonial languages that have served to oppress Indigenous peoples. But for Quebecers, language and French in particular is a matter of who you are and how the words that get expressed out of your mouth reflect onto others. And you can only really ever do that properly unless you're gifted in your own mother tongue. And so in that sense, there's an emotional aspect to what that person was saying. But I thought to myself, since I was given English and French as close to birth as possible, I said, how hard could it be to learn Indigenous language, in this case Mohawk, which was a really stupid thing to think, because it's a really hard language. That's why I said it was naive. It's one of these polysynthetic languages where you have a root and then you build with pronouns and then suffixes, and it builds these really long words. But in English, you have a dozen or so pronouns, whereas in Mohawk there's about 70. And so you got to learn this whole math behind the articulation of the language and grammar before you can even begin to speak the words. So I went about searching people that would perhaps support me in Googling, as everyone else does, and I found a father and daughter combination out of Six Nations called Brian Miracle and Zoe Hopkins. Owanadeka and Garakwahawi are their Indigenous names. So that they took me on, really, and took a leap of faith in me, and I took their online course. And then I can't recall whether it was Brian Miracle or Zoe that thought it was a good idea that I should speak in the House of Commons, but I'm a bit shy and public. I don't come by public speaking naturally. Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, why not? So we worked on, some words over time that I could speak as I followed this course online. Mm-hmm. And, in 2017, I guess I was a parliamentary secretary, the Minister of Infrastructure. I got this 1 minute slot, as we all do before question period, if you're not a minister, to speak. And I just said these words that I worked hard at and obviously knew their meaning. And it kind of went viral because I was told that afterwards that it was the first time that anyone spoke Mohawk in the House of Commons, pretty much ever. And I think, I did not appreciate the impact that could have, despite what I've just told you. And it sort of, and what it has done is allowed me to reach out to people that aren't chief and council, that are passionate about their language. And they know I'm making an effort. I've continued to this day. So that is kind of the genesis of it. And I gave a subsequent speech a year or so later that was 20 minutes that I'd worked on. And it was in that case, it was actually translated so that people could hear. In the first instance, there was a big debate over whether Indigenous languages could be actually used in the House of Commons. So there's a whole backstory behind butting my head up with people that only wanted English or French, but that's probably for another podcast. But since then, we actually were able to make sure that we now have translators for people that, Indigenous people, I would think primarily, that would speak their language in the House of Commons, and it would be able to be heard and understood by the most Canadians. And also the role of interpreters in the House of Commons is a long story that is another, probably a second edition of a podcast. It's really lifting up some really senior voices in communities where they are getting exposure and really translating their languages to people across Canada. Now, my wife plays a prominent role in this because, and I hope this podcast is PG, but I'll try not to swear too much, but it probably rated higher than PG. But when I woke up the next day feeling sort of somewhat proud of myself, having seen all this stuff go viral, my wife said I was full of shit if I didn't continue my languages courses, and she was absolutely right. So I've been continuing to this day, and I try to put as much time as I can into it. But it is, for example, I tried, I listened to elders when I go about some of my activities, and it's hard to squeeze in an hour, but I do my best to. And I have 2 immersion sort of courses that I'm following pretty casually that keep me up to speed, but also I learn, and hopefully I can speak. I can understand some really rudimentary conversations. My response time is that of a 1980s computer.
Yeah.
So, I'm at that. I'm at that level of really at the beginner stages, but pushing, and I'll continue to do that whether I'm a minister or not.
Wow. Well, good. I'm sure lots of folks said that, but good for you. It sounds like a Herculean, if that's the right word, but a big effort. Such a complex language, and so many languages are like that. So that's, I imagine that had an impact, as you're saying, on the institution itself. So that to me sounds like an act of reconciliation, like the institution coming up against the hard wiring of whether you can speak French or English in the House of Commons. That's really. One of the things I like to ask everybody, but in particular men around the Mooseheart, so I'm going to talk about the Mooseheart itself a bit. Has there been one or any particular experience that you've found through wearing the Mooseheart, somebody come up, often it's people coming up and asking you about it, that stands out for you? Any experience, any question, any conversation that stands out for you?
Yeah, maybe I'd say 2. One, increasingly so, I am surprised by the people that come up quite quietly, and they're more often than not Indigenous, really happy that I'm wearing the Mooseheart and the recognition of it. I have an Indigenous staffer who insists that I wear it, and gives me the stink eye when I don't, but which is well earned. But it is something I wear I wear it very often. Yeah. And it's something that is in the awareness. I guess my point is I'm surprised by so much awareness that in different, it's not necessarily just leadership and eminent members of a community that are aware of the advocacy, but people, just regular folks that have seen it and know what it is. I guess the second point is I'm still shocked at people who think I'm a student protester in Quebec because they used to wear these squares and orange in the student movements.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I don't know how much it was really understood or covered in the rest of Canada, but it was quite a thing with kids marching in the street. Kids, just adults marching in the street a few years about a decade ago, fighting for their rights as students. And there were red squares, there were green squares, there may have been other squares, but they see a square. And they think so there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot to. I guess there's curiosity, but I think there's more work to do. I would say on the East Coast in raising that level of awareness, and it allows. I think it's weird that people's knee-jerk reaction when you talk about MMIWG is this is a women's issue. It is absolutely not. It's about more often than not male violence, and I am brushing over underlying root causes that make Indigenous women and girls and LGBTQ folks more vulnerable, and we can't forget young boys and men as well in that discussion. But the knee-jerk reaction is this is a women's issue, which absolutely is not, and it's entire misunderstanding and perversion of the final report, to the extent that anyone would say that, would draw that conclusion, and most typically they wouldn't if they'd read it. But I think the curiosity of people asking about it allows you to, as a leader, it's a springboard to a discussion about these very difficult and painful issues that sometimes have to be digested in bite size before people tune you out, which is a very human reaction to trauma. But I think that those 2 points, both are anecdotes that revolve around awareness of an issue increasingly that still doesn't get enough coverage.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That's it seems everybody we talk to has a story or an anecdote about people coming up to them and what they say and unique experiences. Now we've given out over 4 million of these. Our impact measurement suggests that at least 5 conversations per Mooseheart. I'm sure you got many more because you wear it quite often.
I was joking that I had thousands of them in at home because I just take them off my jackets and I'll have to put them back, but I'll have to put them back in this. There wasn't a couple million, that's for sure. It's definitely a few dozen, but they'll be put back into circulation to create those conversations. But obviously, I think if leaders wear them, it's a conversation starter because you're always interacting with people.
Yeah. Well, we really seek to have a sort of a grassroots and grass tops kind of approach, and we don't know, obviously with 4 million of them out there, what's going on with them. Like we just hear really good anecdotes, so it's always wonderful to hear how people actual experience in wearing the Mooseheart, what's it doing, and how people impacted by it. When you mentioned the final report, the murder missing Indigenous women's final report, and with that, the MMIWG 2S plus in work that's in front of us. A lot of the report has obviously is very sort of focused on big institutional pieces that are going along, as well as a lot of sort of the reality that people are trying to work with. It's a very complex space, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And as you mentioned, how do you bring those? Are there some bite-sized chunks that you're trying to work on right now? Is there some pieces that you're finding you're making progress on? Where are you finding some challenges? I know it's a big, complex piece. I know you're just one aspect of a multi-dimensional field of people working in it, but I'd love to hear anything you're experiencing on that journey right now.
Yeah, a number of thoughts on that, Dave. I think you butt up to the first point you were making, is how can individuals get involved and be aware in such a complex issue. And when you talk about MMIWG, the reaction of the government, if there's ever been any, has been to react through reacting to tragedy, which is you're really dealing with the symptoms. And any policy that's derived based on tragedy is typically tragic in its consequences, because if there's anything the final report underlined, is the underlying root causes that are thematic in nature: health, human security, mental wellness, physical wellness, social justice, all and justice generally. The over 200 recommendations, calls for justice rather, are ones that are structural in nature, and because they are so complex, because they're so pervasive in society, it's not a tick the box operation, and it's not an overnight solution. My frustration is with, as a member of the government, is a reflection of who we are as a government, which is, very good at saying things, very good at making promises. But as in any government, the real test is following through on these things. And as we have obviously started put into over $2 billion in addressing this, making sure that hits the ground, making sure it's tracked, traced, and results are tracked, measured, failures are measured, successes are measured. We're kind of in this space where, despite investments, despite the initiative of the government, despite legislation being passed, on child and family services, all elements that will make women, children, and LGBTQ folks less vulnerable in this society, the results are trailing. And that's frustrating to see. It's tragic for those that are suffering the effects of it. And you realize that, obviously you can't lower your arms and say that you're defeated, but you got to double down on these things. And, as a policymaker, you want to see results with the measures that you're taking. Throw in COVID that has made these same people even more vulnerable because of physical confinement. We know that is one of the drivers when it comes to housing that does make women more vulnerable and often end up in the streets. That is compounding, I think, as well as the mental health matters driven in part by the opioid crisis have created this toxic mix where not only are the results trailing, in some cases, in some areas it's gotten worse. It doesn't mean as a government that you lower your arms and you say we're not going to do anything. I think what I've clearly heard from Indigenous stakeholders and by that principally families and survivors is that there needs to be mechanisms of accountability for the federal government. There needs to be sustained investments and an ability to make sure that we're having, when we say whole of government, the entirety of the federal government, but also provincial and territorial entities, without which we have an imperfect response. And we're not there yet, I think, is the conclusion that I have. And so that said, there are organizations that have been on shoestring budgets that have support now that they didn't have prior to that. There are real infrastructure builds that are happening that will make people safe around this country. I've opened some myself. There are more that are being invested into. But clearly what we're seeing is a need to have a more coordinated approach across the country. And as in all these things, awareness among the general population is one that is very important. And it can't, right now I get the sense that it is still driven by tragedy and, by that spike in interest that I mentioned earlier, and then a drop in it later, which is not the way to respond to something that is so that underpins and pervades any Indigenous reality, particularly if you're in that vulnerable category that the report touched on.
Yeah. Such a complex issue, and I'm, you mentioned perseverance, or you demonstrated the perseverance that's at the root of a lot of making progress on this. And these are complex. You mentioned the word trauma. I agree with that very much. It's a very trauma laden space that we're working in so many different ways. And one of the things I have one more question for you, and I take a zoom way back out for a second, and thinking from a trauma informed lens a bit. Noticing all the challenges and the struggles that we're having. Also want to just, and this is part of the Mooseheart campaign itself, is shine a little light into the darkness. And so, so the question is, if you have a moment or two that you can reflect on where you went, not everything's going perfectly, but I've seen some progress. There's something that gives you medicine that goes, okay, I put some wind in your sails in an incredibly challenging, environment. Are there moments or a moment you can think of that you wanted to share
Yeah, and they often come when one comes. There's again two. Usually I only come up with one because my mind gets focused on one thing. But one comes from a pretty dark place. I've been going around the country making sure that if I am in an area, or sometimes deliberately go to that area, I visit the site of the former residential school and talk to survivors if they make themselves available and want to share their stories with me. And what is surprising in all that is the hope that you hear from them about the next generation, and the hopes that we won't repeat the same failed, disastrous social experiments that they were subject to. And that kind of it's probably one of the everyday thoughts that I think of when we're trying to implement policy is, are we, despite the best intentions, reproducing another failed social experiment? And I think that is a level of thought and reflection that any person in my position needs to have when they're approving things or taking any action. And then actually seeing that hope on the ground when you go into an immersion school, or when you go to a school and there's kids learning in their own language and in their own home communities. So that's infrastructure that is being built in communities, has been built in communities, and is being deployed in the spirit of self-determination, where in the cases that I'm describing, there are people learning, little kids learning in their language, where their parents were perhaps not afforded that, were definitely not afforded that opportunity. In the case of their grandparents, it was actively stripped from them, at times physically, through violent methods. So that I'm hopeful for. Those stories are too few and far between. So I'm not going to trace an overly rosy picture of that, but it is nice to see, and I see it, and it's happening. So we know it's doing good work, and those kids will grow up in an environment that is not that failed violent social experiment that is part of our history.
Wonderful. Well, Minister Miller, I really appreciate you taking the time today. And is there any final words you want to share as we wind down? No,
that's about it. I think everyone should get a moose hide and put it on their jacket or whatever they wear, and then keep it as hopefully it's more than a conversation starter. So thanks for having me today.
No, really, really honored to have you on, and just we'll put in a shameless plug, and for you too, to May 11th, Mooseheart Campaign Day. Please register and come to the event either online. Last year we had over 400,000 people register, and this year we'll have more than that. And it's growing, and it's having an impact, and largely because of champions like yourself that are just willing to pick it up and move it out into the public space. So we're super grateful for your time today and for all the work that you're doing. And look forward to seeing you on May 11th, if not sooner.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thanks a lot.